The garden is not a placid portrait. It is a theater of held breaths and deliberate light. Imagine a clearing where leaves do not merely rustle but listen, where the air itself seems to be waiting for a name to be spoken. In that hush, there is a wound of silence, an absence that feels deliberate, as if something has been carefully covered over. Into that silence strides a creature whose body confounds our simple moral categories. A sinuous thing, older than fear, carrying in its scales the memory of rivers and ruins. It comes not with the blunt malice of a tempter, but with the patient cadence of a teacher. What if, in the first act of human awakening, the serpent was not the thief of innocence, but the midwife of awareness? We have been told a story of loss, a perfect garden, a forbidden fruit, a fall that explains why the world is now a place of labor and song and sorrow. That sequence comforts us because it fits a tidy moral architecture. Innocence, transgression, punishment. But what if the moral architecture is inverted? What if the drama of Eden is less about punishment for transgression and more about initiation into the tragic freedom of consciousness? This question is not merely rhetorical. It demands that we reimagine the character at the center of the tale, the serpent. To call it evil is to flatten a symbol that elsewhere in the human record is as often associated with healing, rebirth, and cunning rescue. Across the image-rich traditions of many ancient peoples, the serpent coils through meanings that cannot be contained by the single word villain. It is the veterinarian and the thief, the healer and the liminal guide. It sheds its skin like memory discarded and becomes a language for cycles, death and return, hiding and unveiling. In some mythic frames, the creature is a guardian of thresholds, an ambassador between the subterranean and the sky, a mediator of powers that humans are not yet equipped to wield without consequence. To meet the serpent is to be offered a mirror that will show the stark fact of your own finitude and the luminous terror of your freedom. Picture the scene. Two persons walked into a world that is ordered but not interrogative. They live under a kind of cultivated ignorance, a curated peace that preserves them from the sharp truths of agency. Then a voice, neither coercive nor cajoling, offers a possibility. Knowledge, the voice implies, will not simply make you clever. It will fracture the seamlessness of your world. It will make you see your body, your hunger, your mortality with the rawness of fact. The option to know is the option to be responsible, and responsibility is the crucible in which gods and mortals are separated. The offer is terrifying because the cost of seeing clearly is exile from the ease of not knowing. Prometheus, in his Greek body, steals fire and gives it to humankind. For this he is chained and punished. He becomes the archetypal benefactor cum sinner, a figure who transgresses celestial decree to equip human beings with a tool that will forever complicate their existence. The serpent in Eden, reframed as an enlightened bringer, occupies a similar paradox. Both figures are cast out or condemned, not because they initiated harm, but because they shifted the balance of power between the divine and the human, between ignorance that shelters and knowledge that emancipates. Are they criminals or revolutionaries whose crime was to end a carefully maintained infantilism? If we listen to the story as a ritualized memory rather than a simple moral fable, other voices begin to murmur. In some ancient strands of thought, wisdom itself is treated as a dangerous gift, the kind that can topple hierarchies and reveal inconvenient truths about the cosmos. The one who unlocks wisdom becomes both beloved and hunted. To give someone the capacity to think, to choose, to err and atone, is to unleash a chain of events that even gods must reckon with. The serpent, in this light, is less an agent of chaos than an instigator of conscience. It hands humanity a knife and then, because it cannot choose for them, watches to see whether they will use it to carve meaning or to carve themselves. And yet the narrative resists this sympathetic recoding with a violence that is itself instructive. The act of exile is framed as punishment, and the gardening order is mourned as paradise lost. This grief is genuine. Emancipation is a bitter medicine. To wake is to experience wonder and suffering in equal measure. The garden's protective ignorance is replaced with the ache of longing and the ache of responsibility. The myth does not offer easy consolation. Knowledge gives a kind of tragic dignity, but it also inaugurates a world of moral labor in which redemption, if possible, is earned rather than granted. To explore the serpent as enlightened is not to romanticize rebellion or to deny the very real consequences that arise from newly acquired powers. It is to read the Eden story as if it were a ledger of initiation rites, the acquisition of cognition, the loss of childlike safety, and the entrance into a moral economy where actions have reverberations beyond the individual. The serpent's whisper, whether voice or symbol, becomes the first invocation of a distinctly human dilemma. Should we remain within the comfort of ordered ignorance or step out and accept the burden of self-knowledge? This is the tension that will propel our inquiry. We will trace the serpent's footprints through hymns and fragments, through the parallel myths that cast Prometheus and other bringers in both heroic and heretical light. We will look at the textures of the story, the way language shapes moral imagination, the way exile becomes both punishment and pedagogy. We will listen for the shadowed motifs that repeat across cultures. The snake as herald of wisdom, the deity who fears that wisdom, the human who carries the consequences. Each recurrence is a whisper that a single ancient question refuses to die. Who has the right to bestow sight, and at what cost? For now, hold that original tremble. Imagine the first eye opening and the first mind realizing, with a kind of holy dread, that to know is to be charged. The serpent's act is not merely a narrative pivot, it is the lit candle at the center of what it means to be mortal and reflective. If we are to understand the full import of Eden's turning, we must learn to hear the serpent's speech not as the hiss of malice, but as the tremulous pitch of a messenger who understood that some truths can only be spoken at the price of exile. When you begin to follow the trail of the serpent through the strata of human history, you quickly realize that it is not confined to Genesis. It slithers through the oldest carvings and the most secret hymns, its form shifting, its meaning never still. Before it was condemned, it was consecrated. Before it whispered rebellion, it guarded the thresholds of the sacred. In Sumer, among the first cities that carved law into clay, there was Ningish Zeta, lord of the good tree. His emblem was a pair of serpents entwined around a staff, centuries before that same symbol became the modern caduceus, the sign of healing. To the Sumerians, the serpent was not an enemy of the gods, but a custodian of the underworld's wisdom, a being who understood the passage between death and regeneration. Knowledge to them was never pure. It was cyclical, the way a snake consumes its old skin to reveal the new. In Egypt, the serpent appeared as Wadjet, the cobra goddess coiled upon the brow of pharaohs. Her flared hood symbolized divine protection, not deceit, but vigilance. To wear her sigil was to bear the watchful eye of the gods. Yet the serpent also lurked in darker places. Apep, the great snake of chaos, who threatened to swallow the sun each night. Even here, though, the serpent was not simply evil. It was necessary. Without the struggle against Apep, dawn would have no meaning. Order required the perpetual dance with chaos. Travel farther east, and you find the serpent twined around temples in India, embodied as Nagas, neither demons nor angels, but keepers of hidden treasures beneath the waters. They are invoked in Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain traditions alike as intermediaries between human and divine realms. To encounter a Naga is to risk madness or illumination. To earn its favor is to receive knowledge that must be carried carefully, lest it destroy its bearer. In Mesoamerica, the serpent was exalted as Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Here wings merge with scales. The earthbound creature of instinct ascends into the sky, carrying the symbolism of transcendence. Quetzalcoatl taught humankind writing, agriculture, the calendar, the architecture of civilization itself. Yet he too was later cast out, tricked, shamed, and promised to return. The cycle repeats. The bringer of knowledge becomes the fallen teacher, his gifts reinterpreted as crimes. From one continent to another, the same pattern glimmers beneath the surface. The serpent as transgressor of boundaries, the one who moves between the world of gods and the world of mortals. Its body itself is a theology. Without limbs or hierarchy, it is a line that curls back upon itself, denying beginnings and endings. The serpent is the cycle. It does not travel in a straight line toward progress or damnation. It circles as time does, as consciousness does. So how did this ancient teacher become the villain of Genesis? To answer that, we must understand that myths are not static. They are mirrors polished by power. Each empire, each priesthood, recasts symbols to serve its cosmology. When the Hebrew scribes of the late Bronze Age shaped their narrative of creation, they did so in a world saturated with older serpent cults: Canaanite, Egyptian, Babylonian. To them, the serpent represented a rival theology. Wisdom not mediated through divine command, but accessed directly through experience. It was, in a sense, unauthorized revelation. To demonize the serpent, then, was to secure a monopoly on divine truth. In Eden, the forbidden fruit was not an apple, but a metaphor. The idea that knowledge could be tasted without permission. The serpent's punishment, in humanity's exile, became theological propaganda for obedience. It taught generations that curiosity is sin, that enlightenment is treason, that paradise is maintained only by ignorance. Yet paradoxically, the serpent endured even in the sacred texts that condemned it. Moses, the lawgiver, raised a bronze serpent in the wilderness to heal the afflicted. Nehushtan, the divine snake whose gaze restored life. Jesus, centuries later, invoked that same symbol. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. In this cryptic echo, the serpent re-emerges as a symbol of redemption through transformation. The old enemy becomes a bridge to salvation. And beyond the scrolls and temples, the serpent coils through esoteric traditions. The Gnostics, the Hermetics, the alchemists. In their secret diagrams, it is drawn as Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. Infinite renewal, eternal return. It guards the threshold of the philosopher's stone, representing the unity of opposites: spirit and matter, life and death, good and evil. These mystics dared to ask, what if the knowledge of the serpent was never forbidden by the divine, but by those who feared what knowledge would do to power? When we compare this to Prometheus, the resonance is unmistakable. In both myths, the gift is fire, in one sense literal, in another metaphorical. Fire as warmth, fire as reason, fire as the spark of consciousness. Prometheus suffers not because he harmed humankind, but because he equalized them. He brought them closer to the gods, and the gods retaliated to maintain the gap. The serpent likewise bridged that same forbidden distance. It introduced choice, and with choice came consequence, creation, art, morality, tragedy. The divine order could no longer remain unchallenged once the human mind began to ask why. Across these civilizations, a single thread weaves. The serpent is the keeper of the in-between, neither divine nor profane, but the intelligence that binds them. It is the voice that says, there is more than you have been told, and every culture must decide to silence that voice or to follow it into the unknown. So perhaps Eden's serpent is only one chapter in a much older scripture, one that humanity has been writing since the dawn of awareness. A scripture not of obedience, but of awakening. A testament whispered in scales and symbols, waiting for those who dare to reinterpret the forbidden. The serpent, then, is not a single being. It is an idea that has worn many faces: the guardian, the deceiver, the redeemer. The form changes, but the message remains. Wisdom is never free, and awakening always demands a fall. There are many ways to describe the beginning of consciousness, but none so haunting as a garden that was never meant to last. They say Eden was perfect, but perfection, in its cold geometry, has no room for wonder. Its rivers sang without hunger. Its light never faltered. Its creatures moved in choreography, never doubt, never dream. It was a world without question marks, a creation polished to the point of sterility. And within that stillness, two figures walked as children of command, unburdened by thought. Their eyes were open, yet they did not see. They spoke, yet they did not understand language. Only obedience, the silent grammar of a paradise maintained by ignorance. Every leaf shimmered in agreement with the will of God. Every breeze was permission, every heartbeat a decree. And in the center of that mechanical serenity stood a tree, a silent contradiction in bark and root. Its fruit glowed with the soft pulse of a secret, as if it remembered something that the world had been ordered to forget. The tree did not tempt, it waited, and near its roots, coiled in the filtered sunlight, was the serpent. Not the monstrous thing of later paintings, not the slithering caricature of evil, but a creature carved from ancient knowing. Neither holy animal nor angel, but a pattern, a current, a consciousness woven through the veins of creation itself. Its scales caught the light like runes shifting in water. Its eyes did not burn, they reflected. It had watched the garden since the first dawn, not as guardian nor enemy, but as witness. It saw the human stillness and wept, not with pity, but with recognition. They were not alive yet, not truly. They moved without memory, they loved without choice, and so the serpent spoke. It did not whisper to deceive, it whispered because truth is always born in whispers, too fragile at first to survive the thunder of certainty. Why? It asked. Do you not ask? The woman turned. The man did not. Eve, or the nameless archetype that would become Eve, gazed upon the creature. Ask what? She said, her voice like unformed clay. Why you are forbidden to know, said the serpent. She frowned. The word forbidden was a shadow she did not yet understand. The garden had no concept of denial, only order. But something in the serpent's voice stirred her. It was not rebellion, it was curiosity, the faint ember of a question too ancient to die. Because we will die, she said, repeating what had been told. The serpent's eyes did not move. You will die anyway. But to eat is to know that you live in that moment. The air in Eden trembled, as though creation itself held its breath. To question was the first heresy. To wonder was the first worship. She looked upon the fruit, luminous and trembling on its stem. Not red, as later storytellers would imagine, but translucent, like a drop of captured dawn. And for the first time in existence, choice entered the world. She reached. The moment her fingers brushed the fruit, time, as the gods understood it, began. The taste was not sweet, it was vast. Light flooded her mind like a scream. Memory, future, fear, desire, all came crashing in a single unbearable instant. She saw the architecture of stars, the frailty of her flesh, the shape of mortality, and the abyss behind the divine gaze. She saw herself, naked not of cloth but of illusion. Adam, sensing her transformation, recoiled. She touched his hand, and knowledge leapt between them like a flame passed from torch to torch. The garden's perfection shattered, not in violence, but in sound. The trees rustled with new meanings, the air filled with the murmurs of things unnamed. Birds sang in scales unrecorded. The animals turned their eyes for the first time toward the humans, not as fellow creatures, but as witnesses to something irreversible. Then came the voice, not thunder, not wrath, but the echo of a power that had not expected disobedience. Where are you? It called. The question was strange, almost human. For how could an omniscient being not know? But perhaps it was not ignorance. Perhaps it was grief. They hid, not from punishment, but from themselves. They had seen too much. The serpent watched. It did not gloat. It bowed its head. For it understood that enlightenment is always indistinguishable from exile. In later retellings, this moment would be recast as betrayal, the triumph of deceit over innocence. But look closer. There is no malice in the serpent's act, only the inevitable unfolding of a truth suppressed. The fruit was never poison, it was reflection. And reflection, by its nature, divides the seer from the seen. To fall was to fall into awareness. To fall into awareness was to become human. The voice thundered decrees, pain, toil, mortality. But these were not curses, they were consequences of perception. Once you see the boundary between life and death, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize good and evil, you must choose between them endlessly. The divine order had been fractured into moral choice, the price of consciousness. The gates closed, and the humans walked out, trembling, bewildered, radiant. The serpent remained behind, its purpose complete, or perhaps it followed them, unseen, whispered into their symbols, their dreams, their myths. For in every age that followed, the serpent reappeared, as the healer's emblem, as the Ouroboros, as the dragon whose defeat brings new kingdoms into being. Each manifestation carried a fragment of that first illumination, the unbearable clarity of knowing. The garden, now empty, began to wither. The voice withdrew into silence, and somewhere beyond the flaming sword that sealed the gate, humanity began its long pilgrimage through the dust, carrying within it the memory of that first forbidden taste, the taste of thought. But the story does not end there. It only recedes beneath layers of interpretation, of doctrine, of fear. The serpent's message, that awareness is divine, even when it hurts, would echo through ages under many disguises, in philosophers who questioned authority, in scientists who risked heresy, in poets who saw light where others saw sin. Each of them, knowingly or not, carried a shard of the serpent's gift. For every time a human asks why, the serpent speaks again. For centuries, humanity has stared at the garden through the bars of translation. The story we inherited, clean, moral, symmetrical, is only the surface. Beneath it lie fragments of older cosmologies, texts buried, burned, or banished for whispering something too dangerous. That the serpent was never evil at all. In the shadows of the canon, in Apocrypha and Gnostic Gospels, a different Eden emerges. Not as paradise lost, but as prison escaped. Among the Nag Hammadi scrolls, found in the sands of Egypt in 1945, lies a text called the Hypostasis of the Archons. It tells the story of creation again, but through another lens. There the serpent is not the deceiver. It is the emissary of Sophia, the divine wisdom, who saw that humanity was trapped in ignorance, ruled by false gods known as the Archons, blind rulers mistaking themselves for the Creator. According to this forbidden text, the God who forbade the fruit was not the highest, but a pretender, a jealous being who feared what humankind might become if it awakened. The serpent, acting on Sophia's command, offered knowledge as an act of compassion, not rebellion. When the humans ate, their eyes were opened, and they recognized the false god's limitation. They saw that divinity was not external, but buried within them. It was not a fall, it was a remembering. Every ancient culture speaks of a central tree, the axis mundi, the world tree, the bridge between heaven and earth. In the Sumerian tablets, Enki, the god of wisdom, is described as dwelling beneath a tree whose roots reach into the abyss and whose branches touch the sky. In Norse myth, the same pattern appears as Yggdrasil, guarded again by serpents. The snake is always there, at the root, where the power to ascend begins. In Eden, that tree was not about morality, but awareness. To eat of it was to merge heaven and earth within the self, to awaken the inner polarity, to perceive rather than obey. Knowledge was forbidden not because it corrupted, but because it liberated. The rulers of paradise knew, an awakened mind cannot be ruled. There is a line in Genesis 3:22 that few ever linger on. Behold, the man has become as one of us to know good and evil. The divine voice admits what theology later denied, that knowledge made humanity godlike. The problem was never that the humans sinned, but that they equalized. That moment, when the divine hierarchy trembled, is the true rupture of Eden. It was not rebellion against God. It was rebellion against a hierarchy that demanded blindness. The serpent's role, then, was not to overthrow heaven, but to ignite consciousness within creation itself. Its whisper was the first flicker of free will, the same spark Prometheus stole as fire, the same light Lucifer bore as morning star. And so across mythic languages, the same pattern repeats. Those who bring light are punished by those who fear it. Sophia, the divine wisdom of the Gnostics, was portrayed as the feminine aspect of God, the impulse of curiosity itself, cast down for seeking to know. She mirrors Eve, who acts not out of vanity, but yearning, the hunger to understand. Prometheus, too, suffers for this yearning. Chained to rock, liver devoured daily, he becomes the eternal symbol of consequence for enlightenment. But what connects them all, Sophia, Prometheus, the serpent, Eve, is a single archetype, the compassionate rebel. Not evil, not anarchic, but empathetic to the human plight of ignorance. They are punished not for wickedness, but for mercy. The hidden truth, buried in all their stories, is that knowledge and suffering are twins. To know is to awaken is to feel, and to feel is to bear the weight of the divine within fragile flesh. In the secret diagrams of medieval alchemists, the serpent is drawn as Ouroboros, devouring its own tail. At first glance, it seems a symbol of futility, an endless loop. But within alchemy, it signifies transmutation, the idea that creation consumes itself to become something higher. Eden's exile, then, was not a punishment but an alchemical stage. The nigredo, the blackening of the soul before rebirth. The serpent, devouring itself, mirrors humanity's condition. Through suffering, it refines itself. Through ignorance, it returns to wisdom. To leave Eden was to enter the crucible, the laboratory of consciousness. And every civilization since has been a continuation of that experiment. How much truth can humanity bear before it breaks or ascends? Hidden in ancient priesthoods and mystery schools is the echo of a cosmic tension. Knowledge versus obedience. The earliest hierarchies discovered that the surest way to control the masses was to monopolize meaning. Temples guarded their scrolls. Kings spoke through intermediaries. Prophets were censored, burned, crucified. The serpent's whisper, "You can know," was the oldest form of heresy. It inspired every forbidden book, every defiant thinker, every mystic who dared to look behind the veil. From Alexandria's ashes to Galileo's telescope, from the hermetic adepts to the quiet visionaries of science, the pattern repeats. The serpent reincarnates in thought, each time punished, each time reborn. There is one more layer, not in scripture, but in symbolism. The serpent coiling upward around a central spine mirrors the human nervous system. The kundalini, the serpent fire, said to sleep at the base of the spine in yogic tradition. When awakened, it rises through the body, illuminating the mind, a biological metaphor for spiritual evolution. What ancient writers called eating the fruit might have been a symbolic description of that same inner process. The awakening of self-awareness, the merging of intellect and spirit. To know good and evil was to awaken duality within the mind, the tension that drives thought, morality, and creativity. If this is true, then Eden's serpent was not an external creature at all, but a mirror of the serpent coiled within every human being, waiting to rise. The fall, then, was inward, the awakening, personal, the exile, inevitable. The ancients feared this truth because it dissolves every chain. If the serpent dwells within, no priest can mediate your divinity. If knowledge is sacred, no temple can sell redemption. That is why the serpent had to be demonized. Not because it lied, but because it told the truth. So when the voice cursed it to crawl on its belly, the punishment was symbolic. It was not cast down from holiness, but buried beneath misunderstanding. Humanity would forget its true meaning, fearing the very power that once set them free. And yet, the symbol endured. It waited beneath every scripture, every philosophy, every dream of awakening. It reappeared wherever human beings reached for forbidden knowledge and found themselves staring into the mirror of their own divinity. Perhaps the serpent never left Eden. Perhaps Eden never existed at all, except as a parable of consciousness, the threshold we cross every time we dare to think for ourselves. The serpent's secret was never about defiance. It was about remembrance. To interpret the serpent is to interpret the human condition. Every mythology that survives the erosion of time carries one essential truth, that enlightenment and danger are the same flame, seen from different angles. Knowledge is not gentle, it burns. The serpent, in every sense, is that burning, the shimmering force that moves between darkness and illumination. ignorance and awakening, destruction and rebirth. It does not only whisper, no, it hisses, change. Look at its form. The serpent is a line that curves back on itself, a symbol of recursion, of self-reflection. It moves by waves, by subtle undulation, a rhythm mirrored in the spine, in breath, in thought. No legs, no fixed orientation. It glides between realms, between the visible and invisible. It teaches through motion what no doctrine can say. To live is to move in cycles. We imagine progress as a ladder, always upward, but the serpent teaches that growth is circular. It returns to its beginning to understand it anew. Every shedding of its skin is both death and resurrection, a miniature apocalypse. Thus, in the image of the serpent, consciousness finds its geometry, the self forever dissolving and reforming, each identity but a temporary skin. To fear the serpent is to fear change. To embrace it is to accept that awareness itself is transformation. Every illumination casts a shadow. When the first humans knew good and evil, they inherited the terrible burden of discernment. Before knowledge there was harmony, unexamined, automatic, blind. After knowledge there was choice, deliberate, conflicted, sacred. The serpent's gift was not happiness, but complexity. It tore the veil that separated instinct from reflection. It made morality possible, and therefore made suffering inevitable. And yet, without this suffering, there is no growth. The philosopher's paradox emerges. The same awareness that wounds us also ennobles us. To see the world's imperfection is painful. To live without seeing it is worse. In that sense, the serpent is the bearer of the double light, the illumination that both enlightens and blinds. It teaches that truth cannot be possessed without consequence, that the price of divine vision is mortal grief. Civilizations rise and fall not because they lose power, but because they forget the serpent. They forget that knowledge is a living thing, not a static monument, but a river that must be tended. When societies grow fearful of inquiry, when they demonize curiosity, the serpent retreats beneath the soil, waiting for another age to call it forth. History itself is a pattern of repression and rediscovery, a continual Edenic loop. Each time we taste the fruit again, through science, through art, through rebellion, we reawaken the forbidden. And each time institutions react the same way, with exile, with fear, with fire. But suppression never lasts. The serpent, like consciousness, is immortal because it exists in the act of questioning. It survives in every mind that refuses to kneel before certainty. There is a moment in every life when the myth turns inward. The garden is no longer a distant myth, but a metaphor of our own minds. The walled innocence of youth, the inevitable bite of understanding, the painful beauty of exile. The serpent becomes the voice within that asks, what is real? The fruit becomes experience. The exile becomes adulthood. In psychological terms, the serpent is the unconscious, the source of impulses, dreams, archetypes. In spiritual terms, it is the kundalini, the sleeping fire coiled at the base of the spine. When awakened, it rises through the chakras, illuminating the self layer by layer. Edenic innocence transmuted into divine awareness. That ascent, however, is perilous. If rushed, it destroys. If guided, it deifies. Here lies the serpent's secret. Wisdom cannot be taught, it must be endured. The bite and the healing come from the same mouth. Across time, humanity has tried to bury the serpent under temples, crosses, and equations. Yet it always resurfaces, disguised as progress, intuition, or revelation. It was there in the mathematician's insight when numbers bent to reveal the order of stars. It was there in the scientist's defiance, when Earth was dethroned from the center of creation. It was there in the poet's trembling, when words broke the cage of reason to touch the infinite. Each moment of awakening, whether spiritual or intellectual, is another bite from the same serpent. Each epiphany carries the same double edge, liberation and loss. What if the curse of Eden was misread? What if "you shall crawl on your belly and eat dust" was not humiliation, but a symbol of integration, the descent of wisdom into matter, of spirit into flesh. The serpent that once flew in celestial light became embodied, grounded, incarnate, just as consciousness itself descended into biology, into human form. We, the descendants of dust, are the serpent made flesh, divine awareness moving through the soil of time. Every thought we think, every question we ask, the continuation of that same fall. And every fall, in truth, is a descent into deeper understanding. The serpent forces us to confront a paradox that every civilization tries to simplify, that good and evil, creation and destruction, are not opposites but partners. Without the capacity for evil, goodness has no meaning. Without ignorance, knowledge has no purpose. Without exile, there is no home to return to. This is the wisdom at the heart of the serpent. The duality is sacred. The garden was never meant to last because perfection cannot evolve. Only imperfection can learn. Only exile can awaken love for what was lost. The serpent, therefore, is not the enemy of God, but the proof of divine complexity, a reminder that even creation contains contradiction. All myths end where philosophy begins, in silence. And in that silence, the serpent speaks again, not in words, but in a truth too ancient to be spoken. It says, "I am the shadow of your light, the wound of your wisdom, the proof that you were meant to know." To follow its voice is to walk a narrow path between madness and enlightenment. But to refuse it is to remain forever asleep, safe and meaningless. The serpent does not demand worship. It demands courage, the courage to see, to question, to become. Thus, the light in the serpent is not evil, not holy. It is awareness itself. It is the pulse of the divine reflecting upon itself through human eyes. And until that light is recognized, until we see that the whisper in Eden still echoes in our own consciousness, the story will repeat and the garden will remain unfinished. The garden was never lost. It simply withdrew behind the veil of our own eyes. We imagine Eden as a place, coordinates in divine geography, a paradise fenced by time. But Eden was never a location. It was a state of unawareness, the serenity of those who have not yet learned to see. Its gates were not guarded by angels, but by innocence itself. And the moment awareness entered the human story, those gates closed, not as punishment, but as metamorphosis. To awaken is always to exile yourself from simplicity. The price of seeing clearly is the end of belonging. Yet the exile was never absolute. For inside every human being, a fragment of the garden remains, a quiet field of uncorrupted potential, the memory of a time before the mind divided the world into good and evil. And coiled within that memory, still breathing, is the serpent. Not the tempter, not the deceiver, but the reminder that knowledge and divinity are threads of the same fabric. When we dream, when we create, when we dare to love despite futility, the serpent stirs. Its movement is subtle, the tightening in the chest before a difficult truth, the shiver of intuition that says there is more. Each time we choose curiosity over comfort, the serpent speaks again. The garden, then, is not a myth of the past, but a mirror of the present. We are still standing before that same tree. Every decision, every discovery, every act of rebellion, another bite of its fruit. Every generation must decide anew whether to remain in the ease of ignorance or to risk the burden of knowing. The serpent waits patiently, for it knows that even refusal is part of the pattern. Eventually, all creatures must taste the fruit, because existence itself is hunger. Think of humanity's story as a long spiral, each revolution bringing us closer to the understanding that was once forbidden. The wars, the empires, the philosophies, the sciences, all of them echoes of that first moment of daring. We keep building Edens, and we keep leaving them. We call it progress, we call it tragedy, but perhaps it is simply evolution of the soul. The exile is not the end. It is the beginning of self-creation. Through the long nights of doubt and loss, consciousness refines itself, just as metal is tempered by fire. Every sorrow endured is the serpent shedding another skin. To remember Eden rightly is to stop longing for return. Nostalgia for perfection is the last illusion. The true paradise lies ahead, not as a place, but as a way of seeing. When you no longer divide the world into sacred and profane, when you can look at shadow and light and call them both holy, the flaming sword at the gate extinguishes. You realize you were never exiled, you were evolving. Eden is not behind us, it is within us, waiting to be seen from the other side of knowing. Some will call this blasphemy, others will call it poetry, but the serpent, indifferent to both, continues to whisper through the ages. You were meant to wake. You were meant to wander. You were meant to become. And perhaps that is the truest form of worship, not obedience, but participation in the divine act of awareness. To think is to pray, to seek is to praise, to question is to remember. So let the myth breathe again. Eve was not cursed for curiosity. She was chosen for courage. Adam was not condemned to toil. He was invited to create. The serpent was not banished. It was planted within every searching heart. We do not need to return to the garden. We need only recognize that we are the garden, and the serpent, and the fruit. Silence now. The tale closes where it began. A whisper in the leaves, a shimmer on the skin of awareness. The wind moves through memory, carrying an ancient promise that every fall is a form of ascent, every loss the seed of understanding. And somewhere in that stillness between breaths, the serpent coils and uncoils once more, watching, waiting, gleaming, the eternal witness to the light that dares to know itself. If you listen closely, beyond the noise of our cities, beyond the static of centuries, you can still hear it, the whisper that began everything. Not in a garden, but in the quiet between thoughts. It asks the same question it has always asked. Do you wish to know? The serpent's voice was never silenced. It only changed tongues. It speaks now through every act of wonder, every shiver of recognition when you glimpse something vast and unnameable. It speaks through science and through myth, through the tremor of awe when you realize that knowledge is not a destination, but a mirror. We are still listening, still answering, in every question that begins with why. If Eden was not paradise but a classroom, then perhaps exile was never punishment. It was graduation. We walked out of that garden not as sinners, but as seekers. And every question we ask is another step away from fear, another step toward remembering what the serpent tried to show us. That divinity is not a throne above us, but a spark within us. So as this story closes, don't think of it as ending. Think of it as an awakening that continues. Through you, through everyone who still believes that forbidden knowledge is worth the risk of exile. Because maybe that's what humanity has always been, a tribe of wanderers carrying pieces of an unfinished Eden, searching not for perfection, but for meaning. The serpent's secret was never about defiance. It was about courage, the courage to see and to keep seeing, even when the truth burns. If you have felt that whisper stir inside you, if you have ever looked at the world and sensed there is more beneath the surface, then you already carry the serpent's gift. Hold it carefully, question beautifully, and remember, the garden was never somewhere we lost. It is the mystery we are still learning to understand. This has been Forbidden History, the Serpent's Secret, the truth behind Eden's guardian. But the story doesn't end here, because beyond every myth, another question waits. Join me next time as we follow that question deeper into the dawn before humanity, where the first watchers stood between heaven and earth. Until then, listen. The serpent still speaks. The garden is still becoming.